A little bit of a look at the Lord's Prayer in Matthew chapter 5 and in chapter 6, kind of leading into that. This evening, I want us to kind of go back to a look at the relationship, the correlation that there is between our relationship with God and with our prayer life. So this all kind of falls back to how do we see God? We've talked in the past about, do we see Him as being a more hands-on or a more hands-off God? Well, based on the way we see Christ pray, and especially in the way that He teaches His disciples to pray, in His request there for the kingdom come, thy will be done, give us our daily bread, forgive us our debts. There's a direct request there for God to be very hands-on, to be very involved in our lives. And so with this, let's go back to that thought of how does the relationship between the people and God affect their prayer life. So if you go back and look at this being a relationship, and this is kind of going to lead us down to the path of really kind of what, at least in my opinion, what the core of what prayer actually is. More than just a wants and needs request line, or more than heal this person, heal that person. It's more of this relational thing which we have going on with God. So when you look at a relationship, when it's good, it's going to be really good. So consider your friendships, your marital relationships, friendships that or relationships you have with family members, kids, grandkids, etc. And then when it's not good, well, every relationship is going to have these rough patches. Sometimes the relationship is like a partnership. And then to go into biblical terms, other times it's like a wrestling match. When we look at the wrestling match with God that we sometimes have, let's first say that it's okay to wrestle with God. There's this pressure that I believe that Christians have, that we must always strive for perfection with God, with that relationship. And that wrestling is really frowned upon. And I think because, and whether that's direct or indirect, because that pressure is kind of always there, or at least that's the pressure I felt from a young child, is that when we have to teach people how to wrestle with God and do it within the safety of the family of Christ. Or else what happens is when they're old enough and big enough to leave us, they're going to, because we naturally don't want tension. And if we can't resolve that tension, then we're going to escape that tension. That's just what happens. If a person's in a workplace and they hate their job and they're miserable and they don't get along with their coworkers, if it can't be resolved, someone's going to leave. And in our relationship with God, God's not leaving us. So when we consider the fact that sometimes our relationship is a wrestling match, let's understand that that is okay. And I base that on, you go to Genesis 32, you see Jacob was wrestling with God, and that's where we got the name Israel. Because Israel literally means wrestles with God. And from that, we see God's chosen people come out of the lineage of Jacob, the Israelites. And you go through the Old Testament, and even into the New Testament Jews, there's continual wrestling and highs and lows that goes on, but there's that relationship that is always there. So if we are wrestling with God, and that is how our relationship status is, if you will, let's look at different ways that we do wrestle with God. One of them is called bargaining. Now, you don't have to answer out loud. Have you ever tried to bargain with God in prayer? I have. I have a lot. Have you ever said that cliche, all right, God, if you get me through this, I'll never do this again, I promise. And then what do? Well, you kind of find yourself backsliding a little bit there. And again, this is not all criticism. This is, with bargaining, we can find a positive avenue if we just learn how to bargain the way God kind of wants us to. So let's keep going here. You go to the story of Abraham and Lot. Abraham bargains or tries to bargain with God continually for the life of Lot. Lot goes into Sodom and Gomorrah. God tells Abraham, I'm destroying those two wicked cities. They've got to go. Then Abraham's like, all right, hold up. Just let me find, I don't have the numbers here in front of me, let me find just this certain number of righteous people. Will you spare the city? All right, I'll spare the city. And then that dwindles down to, if I can just find one. Just let me do this. And so there's this back and forth conversation that's being had between Abraham and God lets him do it. God's bargaining right there with him. Abraham has a great prayer with God that goes through this process of bargaining. And so in it, he found that God's grace and God's compassion are what worked him out here. Because he was able to bargain with God, and it wasn't for himself. And that's kind of a crucial aspect here. It's his bargain wasn't selfish. Because what was he bargaining for? The life of Lot, the life of his family, the life of any righteous people that were in Sodom and Gomorrah. He hears that these two cities are going to be destroyed, and he immediately thinks of, well, surely this can't be everybody. How can I bargain with God here through prayer and do this? And maybe we're not bargaining, maybe we are arguing. Now this is less Abraham, this is more Moses. Moses was a little more stubborn, a little more hard-nosed, the whole reason that he wasn't let into the promised land because he was told, speak to the rock, and he hit the rock. Moses could have been, a little bit of a excitable guy. In Exodus 32, we see that God, in his sort of frustration with Moses, tells him, just leave me alone. And so there's this argument that goes back and forth so much that God, almost like an exhausted parent, says, all right, just give me a minute here, okay? Just slow down, just let me breathe. I say that to my children occasionally. All right, give me space, let me breathe. We've been in the house since the middle of March and out just a couple times, and it's hard on us, it's hard on them. Let me breathe. Not like that much anymore because the weather's been nice. But Moses hears this break as a sign that he could then start negotiating with God. And what's interesting, and with Moses and with Abraham there, with these men which we consider to be pillars of faith within the Old Testament, they're having this back and forth conversation with God. And so this to me opens up doors for us. Because, and again, I might just be leaning more on the way I was taught, my understanding, and you might be thinking, Matt, you're on your own with these thoughts. We try so hard to be reverent and respectful with God that we forget that we're in a two-sided relationship. Now, ultimately, He is God, and He does what He wants and says what He does, and all these other things. But we understand that we see these pillars of faith having these kind of candid conversations with them, venting and getting out what they want to know. You look at Job. Now, Job shouldn't be relegated to just kind of a 2-week look and then we move on. I think that might have been what we've done in the past. So we'll come back and give Job his proper due. We really like to look at Job in chapter 2 when he's called blameless, and then you fast forward through all the middle poetry sections, which is sometimes hard to read and obscure, and then you get to the very end where you see, all right, Job gets all these things back. Yay for Job. Job was a great man of faith. If that's our understanding of Job, we're doing a poor job of really understanding it. What we see here with Job is that in the middle, he does vent some frustrations. He does vent some complaints. He does say some things about God. And then God shows up. And what's interesting, because Job's having these conversations with his 3 friends, and his 3 friends are just spouting out their arrogance and their ignorance. And then God shows up, hearing the complaints that Job's had against him, and he sides with Job, and then telling his 3 friends, you guys don't know what you're talking about. So because Job was honest and real and was having that struggle, that wrestling match with God, God showed up and educated Job on a few things. He says, where were you whenever I made the world? You don't even know when the deer goes out and gets a drink of water. He said, so he kind of, Job, I'm God and you're Job. Let's not forget this. But again, it was that relationship that was being had there. So if you take this back, Scott, go ahead, please.
I'm just waiting for the right.
Sure.
I want to read a passage that I was reading about, I looked up last week, concerning our prayer to God.
Yes, sir.
It's in the book of 1 John, chapter 5,
That's fine, yes.
So, someone brought up the question that God hears Christians opposed to non-Christians.
Sure.
And that's the reason I was doing some math, doing some looking up to get a scripture that I can explain to somebody. If I made that statement to somebody that doesn't go to church or anything,
Sure.
I said, well, do you know if God hears you or not? So this is one scripture, and it says that, according to His will.
Sure.
And how can we know His will? Again, look it up in the Holy Bible.
Sure. No.
Regarding His will.
Scott, that's a great passage which complements this study. One interesting thing there, we said about your translation reads that He heareth us, that being probably King James, that ETH, that's added on to the King James, that heareth, doeth, saith, that's a meaning that word is a continual action that's going on. That's one positive, one great thing about the King James among the other translations which have that language. Kind of hard for us to say, hard for us to understand, but that shows a continual, never-ending action. So if we were to read that means that the way He hears us, it never stops. He's always continually hearing us. So that's a great complimentary verse, Scott. So thank you for that. Absolutely. So when you look at Job, God shows up and shows him a few things, and then they have this conversation, they have this wrestling. So going back to the wrestling that we sometimes have with God, when you're wrestling with God, you're still having contact with Him. You've not completely severed ties. You've not walked away. So there's still that relationship there. If we were to look at our, personal relationships with people, the relationship's going to die when one of the two, if not both, stop talking. If you're fighting, you're still communicating. Now, again, this is not an advocation for couples to start fighting, but at least there's still life in the relationship. And you're both trying to be heard and trying to seek out some sort of resolution. What about the psalmist and the prophets? We know they wrestled with God a lot. You go to Jeremiah. Jeremiah had a lot of thoughts about different things. The psalmist and the prophets, they can constantly bring up, at least the prophets, their frustration with current situations. With the psalmist, 1/3 of the psalms are psalms of lament or complaints. So bringing up to God kind of just their grief with sometimes how the world is not working out. When we look at Psalm 69, it ends praising God, but it begins this way. It says, "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire where there's no foothold. I've come into waters, and the flood sweeps over me." It says, "I am weary with my crying out. My throat is parched. My eyes grow dim with waiting for my God." So the psalmist here is saying, life is overwhelming me. It's taking me over. God, where are you? Saying, God, I'm getting tired of waiting for you. And again, you read the rest of this psalm, the psalmist goes on to recognize that, God, you are my deliverer. But God, you have to hear me. I'm tired. I'm tired of fighting. I'm tired of waiting. I'm just tired. So sometimes we see the relationship takes work. It takes a lot of effort. You go back to Jacob, who physically wrestled with God. At the end, he walks away with a limp. So what's kind of interesting is sometimes we might walk away, or sometimes our relationship with God might leave us with a little bit of a limp. But what we see is that Jacob was blessed by having the lineage come through him, and that name still ring with us today. A little bit of a shift here. Do you know, or do you believe that God is big enough to bear your burden? Because ultimately, when we're wrestling with someone, we're trying to get that burden off of us and onto them. We're trying to give this to them. And so with God, when we're having this back and forth with Him, don't be afraid to tell God exactly what your burden is. He already knows. And He's big enough and strong enough to handle it, even when we are at our highest point of grief and frustration.
You said the word yoke. It made me think of, I ain't sure where it is, maybe it's in Matthew, where Jesus said something regarding yoke.
Mm-hmm.
Let me check, maybe I'm wrong, it's been a while, but did he say something like, let me have your burden, or my yoke is easy?
Yes, put your cares upon me, my yoke is easy, my burden is light.
Where was that at? That's what I was
You had to...
Could be in Matthew, Mark, Luke.
It is. It is. I don't have it off the top of my head.
You said the word yoke.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sure. But no, talking about, alleviating the burden off of a person. So that does work itself in here too. While y'all are looking for that, you started to bring up Christ saying, "Take this cup from me." We see Christ himself wrestled with God. It wasn't just Moses and the judges that were crying out. We see Christ himself wrestled with God. When he was in the garden saying, "Let this cup pass from me." So, some go back and forth and argue, well, the cup means his suffering, or the cup's going to mean his death. Either way, which one of those was taken away from him? I mean, neither one. So he was told no. He was wrestling there a little bit. We knew he wasn't going to walk away. We knew that he was making that request for things to go, at least carry out differently. But he was denied. So what we see here is whatever it is that's weighing us down, we have to stay engaged with God. Keep that conversation going. Sometimes our prayer may be a partnership instead of a wrestling match. It may be natural. It may go in cycles where there's highs and lows. But what we see continually through the Old and New Testament is that God chooses to work through people instead of without them. He has been seeking out His people from the very beginning. When He chose to walk with Adam and Eve in the garden, and when He chose to make man, He chose to have this relationship with us, the lesser beings. He has been seeking us out from day one. He wants this relationship. Many of us go to prayer and think this is going to be the way we're going to get our problems fixed, when really we should be going to Him with these expectations of, this is how I keep my relationship with God alive. This is how I stay connected with Him. Okay, consider children, grandchildren, or maybe you've been on young kids at all for any reason, and have they ever just talked to you about you don't know what, but they talked about it forever? And they're rambling, and they have been for 5 minutes, and you don't know what the topic is, and they're just like, yeah, but all the child wants is just to be connected with you. They may not necessarily need you to fix anything, or may not need you to make sense of what they're saying, but they just want to be with you. Ultimately, our prayer life has to be, we're just trying to be with God, even when the words we say don't make any sense. We're to bring our thoughts and our petitions to God through prayer, even if it doesn't meet our expectations. We grow up seeing God speak through the bush that was on fire. We see Him acting as the thunder on the mountain. We saw Him lead His people as a pillar of fire and also as a cloud and smoke. We see Him send the 10 plagues upon Egypt and then part the waters. We see Him shut lion's mouth and then chase after Jonah with the giant fish. And then things get a little bit different in the New Testament. And I think in some ways we've set ourselves up for a little bit of failure. Let me explain here, and then we'll start to transition to the end. There's 3 or so thousand years covered in the Old Testament. And so I just listed off, 5 or 7, I didn't even count, different miracles. And we spend so much time on these different miracles and these different miraculous events. You go to Abraham and Sarah, being too old to have kids, and then they pray for a child, and then they eventually it happens. I think that's more realistic when it comes to how often the miracles or the miraculous things work. We pray to God for miraculous things to happen, and then when they don't happen, we get frustrated. And I believe it falls back to we have spent so much emphasis and time on these big miraculous stories in the Old Testament that we grow up thinking that these happen all the time. When really, and I'm not downplaying the actions of God. Don't walk away thinking that. But really, these things are very intermittent. They don't happen every day. They don't happen every year, every couple hundred years. And so that's why when you get to the New Testament, yes, Christ performed miracles, and yes, the apostles performed miracles, but that was to establish the deity of Christ. But God, instead of doing miraculous things from afar or through surrogates, through his prophets and through the judges and through different people, he sent his son, Emmanuel, God with us. He sent someone to form the relationship with his people. Because we know the scope of history is enormous. We know that there were so many spaces in the Old Testament between these different miraculous things. I mean, how many years did Israel wait before they were going into the Promised Land? How long did they cry out before they were set free from slavery? How much time is there between the Exodus and Joshua? How much time is there between Joshua and the sun standing still, between Elijah and Elisha, between Elisha and Jesus? Jesus was 33 when he died, but he only performed miracles, as far as we know, for just 3 years. So there's time between these things. And so while we wait and we pray and we ask for these miraculous things, don't miss that the greatest gift that we have through prayer is the relationship with Christ, with God.
In other words, prayer should, we're talking about the fact of it is that we should have an effect upon God, but also our prayers also want to have an effect upon us.
Yes.
And the thought that here you referred to, you're referring to, is Matthew 11, 28, 29, or 30. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Now I said about the thought and consideration that prayer will have an effect upon us. You remember that the church was praying for Peter when he was in prison. And when he was released and went knocking at the door, and the young lady Rhoda came, answered it, and went back and said it was Peter, said it couldn't be. In other words, they were praying that he would fire him, but it had no effect upon them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's easy for us to kind of look at that and kind of chastise their faith. Maybe things like that for them, again, like with everything else, didn't happen all the time. It was so infrequent, those big miraculous things, that they were like, well. But nonetheless, we see there was an occasion when it did.
They lacked the faith to believe of what they prayed for.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. They thought she was crazy. Yeah.
You're seeing things. In other words.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, we were just praying about that.
Mm-hmm. So in closing for this evening, I want to ask yourself a question, or a couple of questions. Why do you have friends? Why do you have children? Why do you have a husband, a wife? Why do you have any relationship at all? Is it so they can give you stuff? Is it so those people can fix all your problems? Or is it so when the problems arise, you can go through it with someone that you know will be there for you? When I was started to date Amanda, and I've probably told this story here before, when we started dating, I lived down in Arkansas. She lived just outside of Dexter in the Essex area. And so one summer, I worked a couple jobs in Paragould, and between my job shifts, because I worked a day shift and then like a third shift type of. Anyways, I would get off work at 5, get in my car, drive an hour and a half from Paragould up to Dexter, spend 30 minutes or less, I don't remember, with Amanda, and then I'd be able to drive back just in time to start my other job. Now, why did I do that? Not because I had a problem that I needed her to hear about and fix, just so I could just be with her, and just so I could have that relationship. And what I was doing was, we were laying the groundwork for something that would carry us through hard times, carry us through challenging times, carry us through great times. Prayer sometimes is absolutely going to work out, and we're going to see the results, and we're going to see these things. A lot of times it doesn't. Let's not forget why we pray, or one of the reasons why we pray. In fact, let's go back to the Lord's Prayer. He says, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." God, I'm seeking after you and what you want. And Scott, with the passage you referenced and where Kenny clarified for us in Matthew 11, it's because Christ, seeking that relationship, wants us to know that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. He wants to go through this with us. So with that, we'll go ahead and close, and we will stand and we will sing our song.